All right, everybody, we're going to get started as everybody still trickles in. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our first ever Young Scholars event with Josh Blackman and Professor Balkin. We are going to try to end by 1:20 since we started at 12:20. So one of our other goals this year is to ask you to please try to respect the speakers and stay till the end. Josh Blackman is an assistant professor of law at the South Texas College of Law. He specializes in constitutional law, the Supreme Court, and the intersection of law and technology. Most important to us today, he's the author of Unprecedented, the Constitutional Challenge to Obamacare.
Available at fine bookstores here.
There you go. He's the founder and president of the Harlan Institute, the founder of FantasyScotus.net, and the proprietor of Josh Blackman's blog. He's a magna cum laude graduate of the George Mason University School of Law and has clerked for Judge Danny J. Boggs of the Sixth Circuit and Judge Kim R. Gibson of the Western District of Pennsylvania. Joining us today is Jack Balkin, the Knight Professor of Constitutional Law and the First Amendment here at Yale. He's the founder and director of our Information Society Project, the director of the Knight Law and Media Program, and the director of the Abrams Institute for Free Expression at Yale. He holds his JD from Harvard and a PhD in philosophy from Cambridge. He's a member of the Academy of Arts and Sciences and the founder of another law blog, Balkanization. His most recent book is Living Originalism, and as many of our 1Ls are probably aware, he's the co-editor of Processes of Constitutional Decision-Making, along with some of our other professors and professors elsewhere. So please join me in welcoming Professors Blackman and Balkin.
All right. How's everyone doing? Good? Yeah? Okay. Thank you. Let the line keep trickling in. You can make your way out the other door when you finish eating. My name is Josh Blackman. I'm a law professor at the South Texas College of Law in Houston, and it is a crazy honor that I'm actually in Yale Law School and people are coming out to see this. I think it's mostly for Jack, so hopefully we'll make this worthwhile. I'll begin by giving a mini con law lesson, but pretend the year is not 2013. Pretend the year is 2009. Okay? If I were to tell you that the president was considering a law that regulates $40 billion worth of the United States economy, the healthcare market, and tries to make healthcare more affordable by penalizing people who don't have health insurance. If this was your final exam question on Professor Balkin's con law exam in 2009, if any of you wrote that this was unconstitutional, Jack, what would the answer have been? In 2009? Would that have been a failure?
That would not have been the correct answer.
That would have been a failure, okay? Now,
We don't fail people here at the Yale Law
that's
School.
right. You give stars and unicorns in the transcript.
We only
That's right.
have interesting answers.
Okay, well, if you went to my law school, it would have been a failure, okay? Fast forward 4 years, or at least 3 years, and the same exam was given in 2009, where the president was trying to pass a law that regulated $40 billion worth of the United States economy and penalized people for not having insurance. Jack, what's the answer now?
It's unclear, but certainly a live question.
Okay, so what the heck happened between 2009 and 2012? That's the story of this book, Unprecedented, the Constitutional Challenge to Obamacare. This isn't just a story about a legal challenge to a law, which you all know about, the Affordable Care Act, which is commonly known as Obamacare. This wasn't just a story about politics, of how Republicans and Democrats clashed in both the enactment of this law and now its subsequent implementation. I mean, even today we have members of the Republican Party who are holding up the government and threatening a shutdown unless Obamacare is defunded. This is going to go on for a while. This is a story of something greater, and that's why I'm honored that Jack is here. This is a story of really the people and how the people worked within certain constitutional channels to even shape and develop the meaning of the Constitution. Remarkably, within 3 years, and again to use Jack's literature, the idea that the mandate, which places a penalty on people not having insurance, went from off the wall, that is absolutely ridiculous and crazy, to on the wall, something legitimate, something that 5 justices of the United States Supreme Court bought. So let's do a little bit more of a history lesson. Back in 2009, when the president was first proposing this law, a number of constitutional scholars looked at this issue, Jack among them, David Rifkin, Lee Casey, and a few other professors. And the overwhelming consensus was this argument was nuts. This is not going...
Not to David.
No, oh.
David Rifkin thought it was unconstitutional.
Oh, sorry. David thought it was unconstitutional, but David was mostly alone. And Steve Calabrese is nodding. He was also one of the early people who thought this law was unconstitutional. But something interesting happened, and I was actually present. So this is a federal society meeting, so I'll give my obligatory plug for the FedSoc. This is an influential group, and the influence of this group isn't always obvious. It's sometimes subtle. So at the 2009 Federal Society Convention at the Mayflower in Washington, which is coming up in roughly 2 months, there were a group of lawyers talking about this law, which hadn't even passed the Senate yet. It was myself, Todd Graziano, Randy Barnett from Georgetown, and a few others. And we were just chatting about, what is it about this law? There's something off about it. And Todd, who had given a lot of thought, said there's something different, He looked to the medicinal marijuana case, the Gonzalez versus Raich case, and he said, well, in the past, the Supreme Court had authorized the regulation of certain classes of activities. But this case is different. Here, they're not regulating class of activities, they're regulating inactivity. And enter the conversation comes Randy Barnett. At the time, Randy was working on something really important called privileges or immunities, which doesn't really matter much now, but at the time was a big deal. And Todd goes to Randy, hey, Randy, let's do something about healthcare. And Randy says, I haven't given it much thought. I haven't really given it much thought. And Todd was basically pleading with Randy, saying, you got to do something about this law. So Randy goes, okay, tell you what, you get someone to write a first draft of a white paper, and then I'll come along with the project. 3 weeks later, Graziano, Barnett, and a lawyer named Nate Stewart, who doesn't get much credit, but he should, put together this great white paper for heritage. This white paper was presented at a Capitol Hill event, which laid out the entire argument that this law is unprecedented, that never before had Congress regulated inactivity, that this violated the commerce power, et cetera, et cetera. You know the arguments. I won't rehash them. But what was remarkable was this wasn't just con law professors talking. This was an event on Capitol Hill with a keynote by Senator Orrin Hatch. And within a couple hours after Barnett gave this address, Hatch entered the entire report into the congressional record. That report would be cited by Republicans countless times over the next month in debate. Perhaps even more important, after the event, Barnett and others took many of the congressional staffers to a green room where they gave them a private briefing on why this law is unconstitutional. At the time, there was no one on the Hill who could even articulate a reason why this law would be unconstitutional. But it didn't stop there. This argument was adopted in toto by the Tea Party. We don't talk much about them anymore, but back in 2009, this was a very powerful force. Tens of thousands of people were protesting on Capitol Hill, saying that not that Obamacare is bad policy, certainly they thought it was, but that it was unconstitutional. I remember I went to one rally in Washington, and I saw a sign saying, overturn Wickard v. Filburn. I mean, at Yale, they can laugh about this. It's remarkable. I mean, you actually had these people, and I think this is what Jack would call probably a constitutional social movement. Also, Reva Siegel's written about this at great length. This was a movement that oriented themselves around the Constitution and trying to shape its meaning. And the rallying cry for this movement was Obamacare. We need to stop this law. We need to stop it. So I won't go into the reconciliation process, but the law passed out of the Senate by basically one vote. I'm sorry, by 60 votes, because they were able to beat the filibuster. Then magically, Scott Brown was elected and replaced Senator Ted Kennedy's seat, and the Republicans had a filibuster. They could filibuster. So the Democrats said, we can't send this back to the Senate. We need to just kind of push it through. So they sent it to the House, they had some reconciliation, and it passed on effectively a straight party line vote with about 34 Democrats crossing the aisle to vote against it. And then the president signed it. 9 minutes after the president signed the law, lawsuits were filed, first in Florida, then in Virginia, then all over the country. And back in 2010, these lawsuits were really viewed as a long shot. Myself, I wrote, I don't see the Supreme Court ever taking this case. I thought there was no way they could take it. This is so clearly commerce. This so clearly, affects interstate commerce that there's nothing for the court to do here. But remarkably, this argument kept giving legs. Now, Randy Barnett and Jack had a number of back and forths where they wrote on various blogs and op-eds, and they gave speeches everywhere, kind of developing and nurturing this idea. And Jack, perhaps unwittingly, helped give the argument legs. I think your brilliant debating with Barnett helped give the argument salience. And then eventually courts bought it. You had district court judges in Virginia and Florida and elsewhere who actually accepted these arguments. They said that Congress can't regulate inactivity. It went to the courts of appeals. You had a circuit split. The 11th Circuit said Congress can't regulate inactivity. And remarkably, this idea went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And you had 5 justices buy the argument that Congress can't regulate inactivity. So what would have given you an F at a real law school in 2009, maybe a star unicorn at Yale, now commands a Supreme Court majority. Whether that's a holding or not, we can talk about that later. But the process of how this argument went from really a laugher to constitutional law in such a short, condensed time, I think is a testament to the power of popular constitutionalism and how people can influence the Constitution. And then one interesting footnote, historically, the people on the right hated this doctrine. They said that this is living constitutionalism, that we want originalism, that we don't want, the people to shape the meaning of the Constitution. But I think this case must force kind of a recognition on the right that this can work in their direction as well. Randy's actually addressed this a little bit. I don't think he had before, but he's made the point saying that while the original Constitution, the document from 1787 doesn't change, what does change is constitutional law. And to the extent that popular constitutionalism can shift constitutional law towards that original Constitution, it's actually a good thing. So this is what I've kind of dubbed the species of kind of libertarian or conservative popular constitutionalism, or originalist popular constitutionalism, if you will. And this case really has so much more salience beyond the actual doctrine. The doctrine, I'm not too convinced it makes a difference. Commerce Clause, yeah, maybe the Medicaid spending might place some serious limits on the government, but the actual notion of where the Roberts Court is and how it can be reactive to these popular constitutionalist sentiments, I think speaks volumes. The Rehnquist revolution ain't over. I think the Roberts Court at least showed that, and I think the Voting Rights Act case, which was on somewhat similar grounds to the Medicaid expansion case, shows that. So I'm going to stop talking now, and because I see Jack is just waiting. He's just chomping at the bit to.
You see, look how chomping I am.
Sure. All right. I will stop
I'm going
now.
to ask you some questions, and then you can
Lovely.
respond. So the first question I want to ask you is a question about institutions. One of the things that's great about the book is he takes you through all of these, he takes you through, there it is, the book again.
For sale at the Barnes & Noble. I'll be doing a book signing right after this one, right in Broadway. Thank you.
He takes you, see how charming at the bit I am to get started? He takes you through issues of legal strategy. He talks a little bit about what's going on in Congress. He mentions lots of things. But the question I guess I want to ask you is, looking back at it and having talked to all the players, what do you think was what were the most important institutional features in getting the Republican party behind Randy's arguments and developing them? Because really, the claim I've made is that I think that this wouldn't have gone very far if Republicans as a whole hadn't really gotten behind it. There were some Republicans who didn't think it had much of a chance, but by the time you get to March 2010, when the oral arguments are held, the party is largely behind the argument. So what do you think were the big institutional factors?
Yeah, so by the way, Jack had an article in The Atlantic in June of 2012, which I'd commend to all of you, which is the basis for this question. It makes a lot of points about the politics. So I think I could give a cynical answer and a less cynical answer. So the cynical answer...
I'd like the answer that's related to your idea about popular constitutionalism.
Okay.
Because that's why I asked it, because it's about your views about what popular constitutionalism is.
All right, so I'll give the non-cynical answer first. I think the reason why Randy's argument resonated so well with people is because it's something that appeals to kind of this libertarian ethos, the notion that the government can't make me do something. You think back to President George H.W. Bush, and he famously said, I'm president now. No one can make me eat broccoli. And broccoli became kind of this image of the Obamacare challenge, that Congress can't make me eat broccoli. I think that channeled some sort of anti-paternalistic sense among the American people that really resonated, especially on the right, which is a general anti-government interventionism. So it's not enough that Randy made some sort of constitutional argument. He packaged it, not just Randy, but the movement, they package it in a way that could really appeal to people. There are lots of constitutional arguments that exist, but people don't march in the tens of thousands on the Capitol, by the Capitol for it. Now, to answer the slightly cynical aspect of it, the GOP needed to stop the president on this. They realized they lost a huge presidential election. They got killed in the Senate in 2008. They got killed in the House in 2008. And this was their last-ditch effort. Even today, look what's going on, down the 95 corridor. We have senators basically holding up Congress to try and get this thing defunded 3.5 years after the law was passed. There was a lot of political hate to make. But I don't think that by itself was enough to engender this support. I think it was this notion that the government had never done this before, that they were making me do something, that they were limiting my free choice. And to the extent that there is a libertarian spirit among many Americans, I think this triggered it. I think the most genius aspect of how it was framed, though, was in this kind of anti-libertarian sense. This wasn't a this law wasn't sold well as something that can actually help people. The Republicans did a much better job at selling it as something that will hurt you. And even today, I think polls reflect that. People still don't know what Obamacare is, but they don't like it. People don't know how it works, but they think it will limit their access to health care. So perhaps it was a marketing message also, but Barnett was able to take a constitutional argument, condense it down into a few word talking point that resonate with the people.
But the popular constitutionalism point also has to do with the way in which people come to believe that policies that they regard are very, very unjust are also unconstitutional, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there were many people didn't like the Affordable Care Act. They thought it was bad policy, and they didn't want it to be passed. But what was magical was the conversion of "I think it's wrong" to "I think it's unconstitutional." Mm-hmm. And who were the key players in doing that? I think Randy by himself and it wouldn't be enough, right? You have to have various institutions of civil society to basically push the constitutional argument and to articulate in constitutional terms, right?
Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what happened. Randy by himself would not be enough. Randy's been arguing for years that lots of things are unconstitutional. People haven't really listened to him. I mean, he famously lost the Raich case, arguing that marijuana that never crosses state lines shouldn't be interstate commerce. He lost that case. But the point I made before, when Randy produced this white paper and then it was introduced in the congressional record by Orrin Hatch, you had the United States Republicans in the Senate take this up. That right before the bill was passed on Christmas Eve. On December 23rd, the Republicans lodged what's called a constitutional point of order. This is a parliamentary proceeding, which you probably never heard of, but it allows the party to raise constitutional objections, and it can't be stopped by a filibuster. This was integral in the heritage kind of strategy of challenging us. They wanted to get this on the record. They wanted to have Orrin Hatch and David Vitter and Kay Bailey Hutchinson and a host of other Republican senators have something on the record saying, we don't just think this is bad policy. We think this is unconstitutional. And the unconstitutional argument may have been kind of crazy, but what Randy did, which you may agree with or not, was kind of thread the needle. He said, listen, I'm not arguing any kind of radical transformation in the country. I'm not arguing that we need to reverse the New Deal or reverse Wickard v. Filburn. All I'm saying is that the Congress has never before enacted a law that forces people to purchase a commercial product. It's something new. It hadn't been done before. It is unprecedented. So if Congress wants to do this, they'll need some new say-so by the court. And I think this made it a lot easier for members of the Republican Party, to the extent that they have any kind of caring about the Constitution, to accept it. They didn't need to say we need to reverse 75 years of precedent. They could just latch onto this argument, which was another reason why it was so salient. This argument worked on its own. And now to Jack's other point, at what point did its bad policy become its unconstitutional? And that's something which I think is only in the hearts and minds of the supporters. Maybe I'm optimistic, but I really believe that the people working this challenge closely thought this law violated the Constitution. Now, they might have thought it violated the Constitution for other reasons, that Wickard was wrong, that Raich was wrong, but we're constitutional theorists. And if we find an alternate theory about why something might be constitutional that matches up with our broader ethos, I'll attribute that to good faith.
Well, let me put the point slightly differently then, so you can understand what's going on. You say popular constitutionalism, but there could be just elite constitutionalism. That is, people who live largely in Washington, D.C., or in think tanks and so forth, come to the conclusion that this is bad, it's unconstitutional. They talk to other folks who are in these various policy and legal elites. They are a major audience for federal judges, and so the federal judges basically, because that's the major audience of people they care about and listen to, they're influenced in that way. So that's Lawrence Baum's article, a book, the Judges and Their Audiences, which emphasizes the role of elite audiences. And that's plausible. I mean, that's a perfectly plausible story because it's a story of circulation of ideas among various elites. And one of the great achievements of the conservative movement was the creation of a sort of mirror image to the set of elites that had been created for legal liberalism. There's this, well, the Federalist Society being one of them, right? It was a way of spreading ideas and circulating ideas and creating policy networks and favors, et cetera, et cetera. So but that's not a story of popular constitutionalism. That's a story about elites, conservative elites now, not liberal elites, and their influence on judges who largely respond to elites. If we call it popular constitutionalism, we have to redefine what popular constitutionalism is. Another conception of popular constitutionalism, though, would be one in which it really mattered what the average American thought or the person who voted for a Republican House member thought. And that's a story that has to be, where media has to play a role. And the reason why media has to play a role is if you look at successful social mobilizations, media has always been there. In the fight for the 19th Amendment, women chained themselves to the White House gates in order to draw media attention. During the Civil Rights Movement, it was very important that the networks were covering what was going on in the South. And I can just go on and on and on. Even if you think about the period of the founding, you have all sorts of people basically sending letters to each other and trying to use the papers to get information widespread. So when we talk about this as an example of popular constitutionalism, I think we can't avoid talking about the role of media in spreading the idea that it was unconstitutional.
Right. Okay. So actually, it's fitting that I'm in this room as Jack asked that question. So this wasn't just about the elites in Washington. That's where it started. But you had this kind of, you can call it grassroots or astroturf, what do you want to call it? But you had this group called the Tea Party. And the Tea Party listens to talk radio. And they watch cable news. And they read blogs. And they're on Twitter. And very quickly, all of those kind of conservative alternate media sources latched onto this idea. It's not too often that you had, in the past, these cable news networks actually bringing on common law professors and bringing on constitutional scholars and having explained to people what enumerated powers means and explaining to people what Gonzales v. Raich said and explaining to people what it means to regulate interstate commerce. There were all these constitutional discussions that happened that really hadn't happened before. And you might be cynical of the Tea Party, and there are a lot of reasons to be cynical, but they had this. But they had these discussions. But this wasn't just limited to the right-wing press. It was also the mainstream media. And there was actually an event, I don't know if it was in this room, the conference for your book, was it across the hall?
Yeah, the conference was right here.
It was in this room, and I actually write about this in the book, where there was a conference, I guess it was May of 2012, for Jack's wonderful new book on living originalism. And a lot of the discussions focused in the media, and actually...
It's May of 2011, because the case comes down, right.
Yeah.
Right.
And actually... There was a panel with Linda Greenhouse, who teaches here, and also Adam Liptak, who's the current reporter for the New York Times.
You're right, it's 2012.
It was 2012, yeah. So Linda Greenhouse actually made a comment to Adam. This is on video, you can watch it, it's online. And she made a comment saying that because the New York Times gave such balanced coverage, she called it a false equivalence to Randy Barnett and others. The notion that this argument was so crazy, but the Times and other papers covered it in a very balanced way, that it actually gave legs to an argument that should not have otherwise had it. And this might be something of a difficult argument to get, but back in 2009 and 2010, this was really crazy. But I found, and Randy would agree, that the mainstream media, the Times, the Times, USA Today, ABC News, whatever, they were pretty fair and straight up to these arguments. And when people were watching the news, they said, oh yeah, maybe Congress can't do this. And actually, Adam took some umbrage to this, and he said that it's hard to cite a false equivalency for the very reason that this argument was gaining legs among the people. You had vast amounts of the American people, when polled, said this is unconstitutional. You had courts striking it down. So it's not enough to simply say that this argument's crazy or off the wall, but if people are accepting it, we need to actually give them some credibility. Actually, I interviewed almost the entire Supreme Court press corps about this, and they all agreed with Adam, saying that this was not something to kind of just laugh away, that this wasn't, I think Linda had a opinionator column at some point in 2011 saying this argument's ridiculous, that there's no way the court will buy this. But the media did, as Jack mentioned, lend this legitimacy. They gave it this air of, respectability. And I think that contributed further to how this movement spread throughout the people.
One of the things there are two more things that are really worth spending time on. But as a contrast, think about the argument that Randy also made in his debates with me, that the law violates the Constitution because they use the Senate version and not the House version. What the Senate basically did was take a bill that had originated in the House, turn it into a shell bill, and then dump the entire bill in. That way they could comply with the literal requirement that appropriations bills have to start in the House. And Randy said, well, this is form over substance, unconstitutional. And after the case came down, another lawsuit was brought raising the origination clause issue. But you'll notice that there hasn't been very much discussion of it in the blogs, in the media, in the press, among politicians. Right now there's a pitched battle over shutting down the government over Obamacare, but I have not heard Ted Cruz or anyone else make the origination clause argument. Now, is the reason because that one really is off the wall, or is it because, in fact, they have not seen an interest in gathering around it and arguing for it the way they did for the Commerce Clause argument.
I think it's the latter for the very reason that the origination clause is something that's kind of tough for people to get. Jack mentioned.
Simple rule, though. All appropriation bills.
But
have to start
broccoli,
in the
broccoli is so much easier. But I'll indulge Jack's point. The reason
House. All broccoli. Has to start
broccoli.
Broccoli must start in the House.
No broccoli served in my house. So the reason why this argument gained so much salience is because it was very easy to explain. Randy was able to summarize into a couple key words. I think it was like unprecedented, unbridled, unlimited. There were like 4 words. It was actually, I didn't put this in the book, but Randy once had this conference with the National Association of Attorneys Generals. And he gave them 4 talking points. It was like unprecedented, unlimited, I forgot what they were. And I actually checked. Greg Abbott went on Huckabee, and he recited these verbatim, in the order Randy gave them. These were very short, salient points that people latch onto, that channels kind of a libertarian belief that they don't want to be.
How we should teach constitutional law?
No, but that.
We should have short, easily digestible points.
Now, let me throw a question back at you.
Marbury, judicial review.
No Lochner.
Right.
Or not a George Mason. Let me throw a question back at Jack, though.
Sure.
But what does this say, then, about the value of common law professors if the greatest constitutional case of the century came from a Heritage White Paper and not the Yale Law Journal? What? No, I think no, but I do think...
What's the background claim in the question?
Because I think there actually was a frustration on many liberal academics that their arguments weren't getting salient, especially with the SG's argument that he kind of rejected it.
I see the question.
Okay, yeah. So
basically, constitutional law professors, most of them, I mean, they're activists, right? We're trying to change the law. They've been in this law school too, right?
You think?
Burke Marshall, who was the Assistant Attorney General in the Kennedy administration and pushed during the Civil Rights era, Owen Fisk. I mean, we can go through a whole list of people. Bill Eskridge, who's been a very important figure in the gay rights movement. So, but everyone like that understands something, which is that most law professors, when they're not in their activist mode, are basically trying to rationalize and apply settled doctrine. So they're not going to be particularly helpful if what you're trying to do is you're trying to significantly change the structure of doctrine, which, whether Randy was willing to admit it or not, he was really trying to do. So from the standpoint of existing law, this was really an easy case. It was not unconstitutional. But Randy's point was try to get people to see that what looked like an easy case wasn't an easy case, and to get the justices to hear it and to decide otherwise. So for that purpose, a profession which is largely about the codification and rationalization of whatever happens to be the case at a particular period of time is not going to be particularly helpful. On the other hand, people who are law professors who are activists understand the playbook. This is exactly the playbook that's used over and over again. The second thing I wanted to ask you, though, is the reason why I was hesitant when you said, well, now is it constitutional, is that, in fact, they upheld the individual mandate, as they should have, because it always was a tax. That was the argument that I made while the bill was being drafted. Mm-hmm. And the most interesting holding in the case now is the Medicaid decision, which was not the major focus of the public outrage. It was hardly ever at all discussed in the media. I had debates with Randy on it and with others as well. At the time, I was rather skeptical they would do anything about it, but it turned out that that's really the revolutionary aspect.
With 7 votes.
Case. Yeah, I mean, the 7 votes have to do with the nature of the compromise that they had to reach in order to solve the problem. But it's now part of the doctrine, and we don't know what it means. It could mean very little. It could just be a decision about Medicaid because of the size of Medicaid in states' budgets, or it could be the opening wedge to a very interesting set of issues about how the government spends its money. But one of the things that's interesting is that what came out of the blue from the standpoint of popular constitutionalism. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to ask you, what is your understanding about the strategy for that particular claim, the Medicaid claim?
So, and I think we'll do this and we'll go to questions from the audience after this one. So what's interesting is I mentioned before that 26 state attorneys general got involved. Florida took the lead, Texas, and basically all the states have voted for John McCain. They got behind this challenge. The reason why they got behind this challenge had nothing to do with the mandate. And this is a historical fact people forget. The reason why Florida and all these other states got involved was because of the Medicaid expansion. And I'll give you a brief 1-minute explanation. What the expansion said was states would now have to cover, I think, 133%. People at 133% of the poverty line would now be covered by Medicaid. Okay, and the states would effectively pay all the costs for the next 8 years.
Federal government would pay 100%.
Yeah, I'm sorry. The feds would pay 100% until like 2019, and then after that, the states would pay
It goes down to 90%.
Yeah,
You
90%.
should also understand that under existing Medicaid, which is designed largely elderly, disabled, and children, the states pay a percentage. The federal government pays a percentage that varies per state, but in no case is it anywhere close to the 90%
Right.
that the state was paying under what Chief Justice Roberts called old Medicaid. Under old Medicaid, you were getting 45, 60, 70%. Under new Medicaid, you would get 100% and then down to 90.
So basically, the states freaked out. They said that this is going to bankrupt us. And this was an interesting point because, as Jack and I just mentioned, the feds will still be paying for the overwhelming majority of it, even after this 7-year period where they just pay for part of it. But the state said this will bankrupt us and we don't want to participate. And there was an interesting event. Governor Jan Brewer of Arizona, who recently opted into the Medicaid expansion. In 2010, March, she sent a letter to HHS asking, if we don't participate in this S-CHIP program, this children insurance program, what will happen to our Medicaid funding? HHS responded in this letter from some low-level bureaucrat saying, if you don't opt in, we will take away your entire Medicaid funding, all $8 billion. Okay? This argument was made in a footnote in the district court brief. It didn't rear its head until Paul Clement's oral argument. It was never cited anywhere. And at one point during the argument, Paul Clement pulled this out of the ether because he's Paul Clement. He said, well, there was this letter from Arizona. It's not in the briefs, but somewhere in the joint appendix. And I think he have the pin site because he's Paul Clement. And Chief Justice said, oh, yeah, what about this Arizona letter? And the Chief Justice was beating on the Solicitor General saying, tell me, what about this Arizona? What about this Arizona letter? Breyer was beating on him. Kagan was beating on him. And they voted for it eventually. And the SG basically said, listen, this is above my pay grade. And that was Breyer's question. It's like, I can't make a representation at the Secretary's power. And this was not an accident. He wasn't surprised by the question. And I did interviews with DOJ lawyers for this book. And they said, listen, the Secretary was not willing to withdraw this power because this is something that the Secretary wants to perhaps use in the future. And I think it was this threat to remove 100% of the funding that tipped the court over the edge. But to go back to Jack's question, this was always kind of the tail that wagged the dog. This was really what drove the states into this litigation, not the mandate. But it was the mandate that was broccoli. And it was broccoli that got people excited. People weren't marching on Washington about the Medicaid expansion. In fact, that sign saying, keep your hands off my Medicare. If you keep your government hands off my Medicare, which was like one of the funnier signs I saw. But this, for the states, there it is. There it is. Yale, you got to give him a second. So this was this was actually a kind of a back issue that gained so much salience. Now, why did it trigger the court? I think this is more in line with the federalism genre that the court's been keeping. And look at the the Voting Rights Act case from last term, that there is something about sovereignty of states and you can't put a gun to the states' heads and you need to respect them. I don't know what this means going forward. I mean, I can't imagine, actually, I talked to Steve Laddick, I did talk with him last week. His dad used to run Medicaid. And I asked Steve, like, can you imagine anything else Medicaid might do that run afoul of this? He was like, not really. I mean, so unless this doctrine expands beyond this, and I don't see any current suits, but it's possible. I don't see what this represents. But I think what it does represent is a recognition that the Roberts Court will be tough on federalism and will be tough on these states' rights issues. The voting rights case just from last term, I think, proves this emphatically, that they struck down a law that was passed by 99% of Congress a few years ago because of federalism. And I think we'll see this because there are going to be more voting rights cases in my new home state of Texas that will probably make an emergency appeal to the Supreme Court at some point this year because we have an election and primaries coming up, depending what happens with the maps. Anything else?
Yes, so take some questions.
Yeah, please, questions. And